Welcome to Leaders in Lending. I'm your host, Jeff Keltner. This week's episode features my conversation with the CIO of Citizen Northern Bank, Alex Balagour. Alex has a really interesting journey into the financial services space. We'd kind of go through the shifting mix of products and maybe products that we need to be offering consumers, the value of offering frictionless experience, how you meld that with the human touch of a branch or a call center. And one of the really interesting conversations, what is and isn't a fintech? How are they different than traditional partners or FIs? I think it's a really interesting conversation for anybody who's really curious about the technology and the future of technology in the banking space. Please enjoy this conversation with Alex Balagour. Alex, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Jeff. Glad to be here.
So I started asking all my guests the same first question, and I've really enjoyed the answer, so I'm going to stick with it, which is, most of us when we were kids did not grow up dreaming of being bankers or working in a bank, I think. So tell me a little bit about the path that brought you to where you are today.
Honestly, it's a connection with somebody in grad school. And coming out of grad school, I went back to the industry where I was at that time. And a few years later, I got a call from a classmate saying, "Hey, listen, why don't you come work for me?" And my response was, "I know nothing about banking. He told me, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out together." And that was about 10 years ago now. So since then, I've moved on to a different bank, obviously. And I'm currently in the CIO role of C&N Bank.
Interesting. So a call from a classmate drags you out of another industry into the banking space. The stories of how people end up in banking are really fascinating to me because they're all different. That's great. So I wanted to start this conversation off with a topic I've talked about with a number of people, but I think for a CIO in particular is interesting, which is how do you think about the kind of changing mix or product mix for customers of banks over time? I mean, it's interesting. We see certain products on the wane, certain products on the rise. I think customers still looking for products that maybe don't exist. How do you see the kind of shifting mix or even holes in the product offering set that you have as an institution?
So maybe it's a little bit of a personal bias, but I'm looking for less products and more flexible products.
Interesting.
So in a perfect world, I kind of took a quick survey of my personal financial life, and I have dozens of financial institutions, multiple dozens of different account types. And I'm kind of wondering, why do I need that many? Because the reality is that they all have very specific jobs that they're doing for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, wouldn't it be nice if I had the flexibility when one account could provide it all, or at least fewer accounts?
What would one account to rule? I feel like I'm in Lord of the Rings. One account to rule them all. But what would such a thing look like? What do you mean by that?
Well, as I go through my day, I need to spend money, I need to save money, I need to borrow money. What if I could have an account where, on the good months it's positive and I'm accumulating funds in that account, and I buy a house, it goes negative, I get paid, my debt is getting reduced. I go to the grocery store, getting increased. It's maybe it's a little bit of a nirvana state, but certainly fewer accounts is probably the way to go, with greater flexibility without, very detailed underwriting for minuscule lines of credit, buy now, pay later every store, right? Just more consolidation for simpler management.
It is so interesting when you don't think about incremental changes to the state of the world, but kind of go, hey, first principles thinking, like, well, what does someone actually need? And you are right that it's pretty straightforward. I told you the story earlier, but I'd love to get your reaction to it here, which is like, I feel like we're so far from that state. And so I actually called one of the financial institutions I worked with and just kind of wanted them to keep a little bit of money in my savings account, for buffer, like a little bit in my checking, a little buffer in my savings, and just flow the rest into my investment accounts. And like, could you just do that? And their response was to offer me a quarterly conference call, which didn't feel like an impressive thing. So it feels like there's a lot of room between where we're at today in terms of ease of either using multiple products or kind of combining the capabilities of multiple into one experience for the consumer in that kind of nirvana state that you mentioned. Feels like a lot of room for even steps along that journey, if you will.
That's a very good point. When I kind of think about my role as the head of technology, one of the jobs that I have is to make corporate world, corporate technology, business technology, more consumer-like,
Mm,
so that things are in the office are more like the Facebook on your phone, right? Nobody ever gave you a Facebook training manual, right? So why should somebody in deposit operations, a credit department, have a training manual on how to use their technology? But perhaps there's the opposite that's in play as well, that some of the commercial banking services that are available, like sweep accounts,
mm,
why aren't they accessible to consumers? Because that's exactly what you just described. Wouldn't
yeah,
it be nice if you could have a sweep account for your personal life,
yeah.
without having a massive banking relationship?
I would like to have a sweep account for my personal life, but I have yet to find someone to offer me such a thing. But I try.
So if we set one up, can we earn your business?
I love it. Sell it on the podcast. Yeah, set one up. We'll have a conversation. Um, I, I love that. So, how do you think about, one of the other things I hear a lot about in the technology world is this kind of the shift to digital and the desire to get, I've made the point quite a bit on this podcast and in other places about the difference between just getting digital and getting to something like a frictionless experience, right? I feel like there's digitize the old way of doing things, and then there's build a digital way to do the thing the consumer needs to get done. I'm curious what you think about in terms of the capacity to build not just digital versions of the current experience, but better experiences, less frictionless, or not less frictionful, more frictionless experiences in a digital context.
I think we still have a way to go. So there are clearly a lot of companies that took us forward. But I see a couple obstacles, maybe one around identity. We spend so much time verifying who you are in the digital world, as opposed to actually getting you into whatever banking products
Mm-hmm.
you were looking for. Um, that's a bit of a wish of mine, that there was some sort of central identity provider that's universally accessible. We all have, at least in the United States, we all have social security numbers.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really a far stretch from using that as a universal login, yet it does not exist. And the network effect is lagging. So if there was ever some type of blockchain based
Mm-hmm.
universal identity provider, that would certainly take a ton of friction out of this onboarding experience.
Yeah, it is
And
fascinating how much of the is tied to identity verification and getting that right. How do you, the blockchain is an interesting way to approach that. How do you think about that as a solution? That's maybe if we got some entrepreneurs or some entrepreneurial bankers listening to the podcast. Here's a business idea for you. But what do you mean by like doing something on the blockchain regarding identity management? Help me think through that a little bit.
just I guess the whole concept of private public keys, and
Hmm.
the blocks themselves that are not changeable over time, and the ability to have a little bit more verification of what's in that blockchain as opposed to like a regular database.
Hmm.
So there are actually a couple of startups that are doing identity provisioning on the blockchain.
Hmm.
I think they just lack the network effect. Like there's just not enough volume of people with their identities on that blockchain. So that will take a little bit of time to build out.
It's one of the classic, I think, two-sided marketplace kind of problems, right? Where a consumer is not going to come and put their information into such a blockchain, claim their identity, so to speak, unless there's a set of services that they can access and unlock for doing so. And on the flip side, uh, the service provider doesn't particularly want to integrate into such a blockchain or such a blockchain or not any kind of solution like this, unless there's enough consumers there to make it, the what's my sales guy's favorite phrase is the juice worth the squeeze, right? You gotta have enough people there so that you can actually expand your the number of people using that frictionless experience. I don't know, that's a difficult catch 22 kind of problem to solve, so I don't quite know how that happens.
I do not know either. I'm optimistic though that people smarter than you and I are trying to figure it out.
Do you think people want that? I mean, there's this question of like, do we value privacy? How much do we value privacy? Am I willing to have kind of a unique identifier? Do I want to split my identity up and not have one kind of thing that connects me all over the place? What's your sense of where the consumer's privacy preferences, or what the privacy kind of implications of something like that would be?
You know, that's an interesting question, because personally, I tend to guard my data as much as I can. But I had a marketing instructor in grad school who was the complete opposite. His premise was, I want to tell everybody as much as I can about my preferences so they can market and sell to me better. That's going to make my life easier. So I think there's a spectrum of individuals out there, and actually, I think you pointed out that it's a matter of expressed preference versus communicated
Yeah,
preference, right?
revealed
So when
preferences.
people, yeah. So when somebody is asked like, "Hey, I'll give you 2% off for your social security number," all of a sudden people are willing to volunteer that information.
Yeah, people tend to state that privacy is very important to them when surveyed by journalists or whatever. But then when it comes time and Facebook asks you for something, some piece of information, somebody asks you your mother's maiden name to set up an account, it turns out that we're pretty willing to part with relatively sensitive information for relatively low value, which tends to maybe there's a lack of understanding of the real cost of that exchange on the part of the consumer. But certainly the revealed preference for consumers would seem to be closer to the value that your marketing professor had in terms of I'm willing to give up quite a bit for the value added service capabilities that I can receive in exchange. And maybe we're too dismissive of the value of what those things are, because people seem to, at least at a practical level, be willing to make the trade pretty readily. So what's your perspective on fintech as an industry? We were chatting about this earlier, and I thought it was a really interesting discussion. You're a tech guy in a fin company, to use the standard terminology. What's your take on fintech and where its place in the ecosystem is?
Now, I'm kind of curious to know how many of the fintech founders know where the first computer that went into commercial operation was placed, right? And I'll cut to the chase.
Wasn't it
It was
Google?
Bank of America.
Bank of
It was
America, not Google.
Bank of America. So the first commercial computer in operation was in Bank of America. So by definition, banking industry with the General Electric going electronic is kind of like the grandfather of all fintechs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, this day and age, what company is not a tech company? So the entire fintech, as the label, doesn't quite make sense to me. It fits into the category of we drive on the parkways and we park on the driveways. I don't quite understand that, but it's really just around. It's a different way of outsourcing, right? So a bank, I think it would be pretty smart to partner with a number of fintechs as the means of outsourcing certain jobs that the bank is not willing or capable of doing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And as an industry, we've been doing this for decades, right? As long as the industry been in operation.
Yeah, I'm curious why. I totally agree, and I get this very interesting. You make two good points. I think one, the kind of fintechs viewing themselves as somehow totally different than what's gone before. Where in reality, there have been many tech forward financial institutions for a while, and maybe there's a difference in degree, but maybe not as much a difference in kind as many like to believe. The other to me is this interesting point that there have been technology partners to financial institutions as long as there has been technology. Even to, I would say, the original fintechs were probably the big core providers. And banks are very comfortable not building that software. I mean, almost every institution I know has acquired a variety of software solutions to help them outsource parts of their business. And yet there seems to be a different reaction to the current wave of fintechs in terms of banks' comfort in partnering with them to outsource or leverage for certain capabilities. I'm curious why you think that is. It feels to me very different than what we've seen in the past, where there's a lot of utilization of third-party service providers. Just don't call them fintechs, right? And now there's this kind of like fintech as the enemy versus as the partner perspective on the behalf of many bankers. It feels, to your point, like, haven't we seen this movie before, and why does this one feel different than what we've been doing for the last 30, 40 years?
I'll just give it my opinion, which may be different from others, but it's probably because the current wave of outsourcing, the technology partners are smarter in claiming their share of the revenue. So I think they're just better positioned in negotiation, or saying we're the ones bringing you customers, or our part of the value chain is more valuable. And at the end of the day, the bank cannot outsource everything, right? They actually need to do something to collect the economic value for their service.
What do you think of that? Like when you think of is your institution or your vision kind of over the next years at at CNN, CNN. I don't want to sound like I say CNN. That's a different institution. But what is that core for you? What is it, the thing that you feel like, hey, this is the thing we have to do to add value that separates us, differentiates us, and gives us our part of the value chain versus where that context is that I can go and find a partner or outsource, however you want to think about that?
Our story may not sound very different from a good community bank, but certainly relationship and knowing our customers is a big part of it.
Hmm.
We, I am now with a bank that's 165 years old. Like not many businesses can claim that type of heritage,
Hmm. For sure.
and that I find personally very fascinating. Um, but at the same time, how do you not lose sight of 2022, that the definition of community is shifting? For example, my significant other is spending more time on the Ridgeback Facebook groups than
Hmm.
with our neighbors next door, right?
Hmm.
So as the definition of community shift, how does the community bank adapt to that to maintain the relationships that we so value in a digital sense? So that's our challenge right now. That's what we're trying to solve.
I'm curious I want to, sorry and prep you for this, but I want to throw it back to kind of the first topic we had, which is how much do you see the innovation the institution needs to do being on the technology used to provide the service or product versus on the product or service itself? And we kind of started off with this kind of like, why can't I have one account to rule them all, or at least some seamless integration of different kinds of accounts that as a consumer, I kind of want to have be my pot of money. And to me, that feels like that's innovation on the actual financial offering that you're making as an institution versus on the technology that's used to originate, deliver, service that product. And I'm curious if you have any construct or framework in your mind for where you think about innovation on the actual offerings and how we make them simpler, more streamlined, more valuable for the customer, be they commercial or consumer, versus on the kind of tech. I think so much of what we think about as a technology used to deliver the product being innovative or different versus the actual products and offerings being, something that are shifting themselves over time.
I think it's both, and I would also add maybe a regulatory framework, right?
Mm,
And the regulations have done a lot to kind of like keep consumers safe and keep the institutions and the entire network of financial
mm,
systems safe. But at the same time, they introduce artificial constraints, which makes it harder to innovate on the product side.
mm.
And not until too long ago, that limit of 6 withdrawals from a savings account per month, right?
Yep.
I'm sure there is a reason for that 50 years ago, right? What is the reason for that today?
Yeah, I
Um,
always say, what's the difference between a checking account and a savings account? And I find out it's like how many times I can withdraw from the account.
right,
Oh,
right.
okay. Um,
In today's consumer preference, it makes no difference, right? I would love to have one account that pays decent interest rate and I can write checks from it, right?
yeah, yeah.
It will make my life easier.
Yeah, I actually had one guy, not to totally distract, but who kind of said, you can run a positive balance on a credit card. So why don't you just combine the credit card and the depository account and just like put your paycheck in, run a positive balance, pull it down when you're, like, which to your point is, I think he was kind of pointing towards the same idea of now it's one pot of money and sometimes it goes positive. And maybe he wasn't talking about earning interest on that, but sometimes it goes negative when you spend more than you have. But it's like a singular account that is going to flex at least on the natural spending one way or the other for you very easily. So I think it's really interesting to think about. Are there ways our regulators going to help us find ways to kind of simplify the product mix and capabilities? Because that's a really interesting area of innovation that I think is sometimes left on the table when we get down to like user experience, mobile first, and we're really talking about the delivery technology vehicle for the product when some of the interesting innovation opportunities really on the product itself, on what we're delivering and how we're delivering it and how we're providing value to that customer.
But on that note, I definitely see there's a lot of technology application opportunities.
Yep, for
Right?
sure.
We are so early in the cycle. We probably have another decade before it comes to like truly nirvana state.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have predictions about what the next or advice on areas to invest? I feel like there's that Gartner hype cycle curve, and I feel like digital banking technology is about to enter the trough of disillusionment, which is actually, according to the Gartner hype cycle, where a lot of the value is actually created. There's kind of like the overhype, then there's the like tough work of actually building all the stuff that adds real value over time. And it feels like, hey, nothing happened. And then, that's when a lot of the actual value is created and the work is done. And I feel like we're going to be now in that period of like, we got to go do it. And it's non-trivial, right? So I'm curious your advice on areas of investment or key projects or priorities in terms of that application of digital technology, which, as you say, we're long ways away from taking that to the nirvana state, just on the application of technology for delivery. Where do you see the kind of low hanging fruit or the things that are most valuable to be investing in now?
Um, I guess there are a couple of areas. The first one that just jumps to mind is just the efficiency of the back office operation
Mm,
processes. There's just so many community banks out there still that um, have a lot of people manually do things in the back office. And frankly, that maybe they're a constraint to growth, right? Like if you
mm,
can solve those challenges, you can grow easier without having to find. And we all know, we all hear the mass resignation and talent is hard to find, right? So that's not just tech talent. It applies to a teller at a branch. So having the processes that are more optimized so you can grow without having to hire 10 people, you can hire maybe just two and still grow at the same pace. That's one.
mm,
Um, Certainly data and analytics, like you can't ignore that.
mm,
There's just so much to master. And it's another area of that outsourcing, right? Like fintech partnership or creative outsourcing
mhm.
is what you do because that requires certain compute processing and scale that many community banks cannot afford on our own. Um, and I think I'll be silly to not mention customer experience. So if your banking app is still from the 80s, well, I don't know if there were banking apps in the 80s, but if your banking app is from Y2K time frame,
Yeah.
right? Phones, like that's just not going to cut it. Sooner or later, you're not going to get new customers. People do switch because they can't take the pain of interacting with your organization.
I got to say, I love that answer. And I love that the first two part of your three parts, because you gave us three things, are not the consumer experience. And not that the consumer experience isn't important, but I think it's kind of, I described this derangement syndrome in Silicon Valley, the kind of shiny object. And I feel like the customer experience is the shiny object for a lot of digital transformations versus the back office operation simplification, which by the way can also mean reduction of friction for the consumer. If I'm automating ID verification, I'm making my consumer experience better, not by focusing on the consumer experience, but by focusing on the back office, the integration. And then I think that data and analytics layer is so critical to real success. And yet I worry those are areas that get underinvested in because they're not as, they're not as shiny, right? They're not as bright and new and obvious. It's harder to take into the boardroom where I can look at the great new mobile app. It's easy to take that into the boardroom and like, look at my new data analytics platform. It's so much faster. And I got 5 data sources integrated for much better. Like it's not as easy a story to tell, but it may be more valuable over time as the infrastructure you have to get right. So I love that you start with those answers and get to, see, I'm not trying to downplay the value of customer experience either, but I do think if you don't lay the groundwork for the things that can make a big difference in the business, then that's not going to be sufficient to just focus on the customer experience and the digitization effort.
It seems like a lot of the customer experience, when you hear about technology companies focusing on customer experience, a lot of it is about onboarding a customer as
Mm,
opposed to servicing a customer.
interesting.
And in the banking back office, that's where the customer experience breaks down, right? The
Mm,
first time you have to call, well, why do you have to call, right? But the first time you have to call and it takes a long time to resolve your issue, that's a negative reputation hit,
mm.
right? So that's as much part of the customer experience as getting the customer into the bank.
So how do you think about the value of customer interactions in the digital world, like human interactions is what I'm talking about, and be they, in person, I think branch oriented or call center or chat or whatever. Like, how do you think about, what that means, the value of that, and the way you support that in a digital context moving forward? 'Cause I think it's just a really interesting question of like, are we all going to move to where it's just the phone? And I interact with just an app, or is there a place for that human element and even that in-person element as we build out the digital future?
It's kind of hard to say in person after the last 2 years we had, certainly more in person like this. But I think it really depends on the customer preference and what situation they're in. If they want to just check the balance, it's on their phone. Nobody's going to want to call and talk to somebody about their balance. But as the kind of like the risk profile of their need or the criticality of their need goes
Hmm.
up, sooner or later they want to either chat with someone or get an answer real time that's impossible to get on your phone,
Hmm.
or frankly talk to someone and say, hey, listen, I'm about to do this complicated thing. Can you walk me through the process? And those things, they may never be all on your phone,
Hmm.
depending on what that situation is. And there's a lot of value to that. And, frankly, you know, as the consumers or customers get into a critical situation, that's where we can shine.
Yeah.
My wife has been to a branch once in the last 10 years when her purse was stolen, right?
Mm,
Like she wanted that immediate gratification of talking to a person and having somebody tell her that she's going to be okay and nothing is going to happen to her account.
yeah, yeah,
You can't get that from an app.
yeah,
I live outside of Philly. I was on Walnut Street in Philadelphia, which
yeah.
is, I guess many years ago before the pandemic, kind of like this walking restaurant place. So I found a debit card and I pick up the debit card and I'm a banker, right? So I'm like, okay, well, this is not good.
Yeah, somebody's having
I
a bad
try
day.
to call that institution so that they can tell their customer that their debit card is safe, maybe reissue the card before the customer even calls them.
Hmm.
I couldn't do it. It was one of the fintech credit cards, debit cards, and
Mm,
the only way for me to communicate with them is through their app. I would have to install the app, have an account, and chat or do something like that. I couldn't call them to inform that I found their debit card
really?
found. And this is just, this is an example taken to the extreme, right? And maybe, one way I think about it is that tech companies love their tech, banks love their customers, right? Like there's a
Mm,
slight difference between how you see the world.
that's a great phrase. Tech companies love their tech. Bank companies love their customers. I think it's so true. And one of the refrains I hear that I think is fascinating is like, if you deploy technology right, you make it easier to talk to somebody when it's needed. Because to your point, like people stop calling in to ask about their balance in simple stuff because they don't want to talk to somebody. They're going to take the easy path if you give it to them. And the way to deploy that capacity is often to make it, when you do need to talk to somebody, it should be equally fast and easy, right? It should be like, hey, I actually need to talk to somebody now. That should be like a quick answer, not a 15-step IVR and a 20-minute on hold wait or whatever. Like we can make it easy to talk to a human when it's necessary. I think there's, to your point, tremendous value. Those moments are very valuable to the consumer. And if you can meet them and meet their needs in that moment, I think they really do remember that. Any other thoughts on the role of the branch? We talked about this a little bit, but I'm curious, like, do you see that going away for more virtual human touch and a more phone video conference? Where I mean, we're here. I'm not in Philadelphia, obviously. We're not talking face to face. I haven't done a pod. We were talking about doing a podcast episode in person. I actually don't know how to do that. Like, how do we set up the microphones? Like, I've never done a podcast in the same room with the person, which I'm sure is doable, but we've never done it. Um, what do you think about the role of the physical branch in that kind of in-person human interaction versus the more, technology mediated human interaction?
I'm kind of wondering if a branch could be a good location for a podcast, right? Bring two people
Oh, we
together.
should try. I was like, I really want to do this, but I don't, which camera do we use? Do we have two microphones or one? I don't know what to do in the in-person setting. It's kind of strange.
When I hear about banks that have like thousands of branches, that kind of like puzzles my mind a little bit. But at the same time, it's hard for me to see a world where there are no bank branches. That they're certainly going to change how they look and act. Um, Again, nobody's going to come to a branch to check their balance, right? But which I think they may have done in the past, right? And that's before my time. But I do think maybe as a community center, and I'm not talking about coffee shops model where you can get a latte with your checking account, but could that be a shared working space? Could that be a venue to bring people together when they need to? I think we need a lot more creativity with how to utilize that real estate without simply saying we're going to get rid of it. We don't need it, right? It's certainly a great billboard space, but there's more to it that smarter banks are figuring out.
I think it'll be a fascinating thing to watch evolve because I agree with you. I don't think it's going away, but it's not even now. Not only would I not go into a branch to check my balance, but when I do something like an ATM deposit, they're like, would you like us to print your balance on the bottom? I'm like, no, I don't need you to print my, I've got that on my phone whenever I want. I can see my balance very easily. So the needs are changing, and I think it'll be interesting to see how we shift with them. All right, Alex, well, we're coming to near the end of our time. So I've got the same three questions that I ask everybody at the end of the podcast, just like the one I ask everybody at the front. So let me throw those at you now. Number one is, what's the best piece of career advice you've ever gotten?
It was really kind of like know your strengths and
Mm,
weaknesses and play to your strength and don't try to overcompensate and spend too much time, energy on your weaknesses.
I like that.
Find somebody who can round you out and you just keep plowing forward with what you're good at.
That's fascinating advice. I do. So often we hear about being well-rounded and focus on your weaknesses. And I think it's great advice. Like focus on your strengths. What are you going to be really awesome at and find ways to compensate for your weaknesses versus trying to shore up the areas where you'll never be best. and not focusing on really becoming best in class at the things that you're really good at. It's a fascinating, maybe counterintuitive to the most common sets of advice that I hear, for at least to kids and things. What's the best advice you've ever gotten about the banking industry writ large? You were brought into this through a phone call from a friend 10 years ago. What's the best lesson learned you've gotten about the industry writ large?
It really was kind of like, don't forget your experience from other industries, right? Because other industries tend to look at the value chain and break it up, and banking is simpler. There's no inventory, right? There's no supply chain management, so to speak, but yet there is a value chain, and not losing sight of that in banking is pretty important. I think if you lose sight of it, you turn into an also ran, as opposed to someone who's not afraid of fintechs and able to partner for them with the right part of the value chain.
Understanding your value chain is certainly critical to running any business I've ever seen, and where you're adding value, and where you can find partners who are better at providing value in certain portions. Great advice. And last question, what's one bold prediction for the future?
I'll stick to banking future.
All right.
I guess I'll go with, I think the importance of FICO score is going to continue to diminish over time. Maybe not the most popular opinion, but there's so much data about who we are, and FICO score only takes a fraction of it into account, unless that score itself gets greatly revamped.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I think while many people would not disagree with you, I think the credit policies in most institutions would indicate to others that that is still a pretty entrenched and a relatively bold prediction about the reality, because I think the sense that that's possible versus the reality that we've substantially moved beyond credit score and evaluation of credit are very different things. And it's probably an interesting time to watch those two things converge on one side or the other. So I like that, Bull. Certainly we at Upstart agree with that prediction. So I'm not going to disagree with you on our prediction that credit scores become less central to credit determinations over time. Well, Alex, I appreciate you making the time. Thanks so much again for joining us. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.